Hello, everybody. It's Jacek Bartosiak here, Strategy. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today, my guest, again, for the second time, is James Rogers. Hi, James.
Hello, good to be with you.
We talked, a few weeks ago, speaking of the grand strategy of US and UK and the future of Europe. Let's follow up on that, please, especially given the fact that Joe Biden visited Europe, had important meetings in NATO, and also he was having a meeting with Vladimir Putin. He visited UK. So what do you make out of it? I mean, what is your assessment of this whole trip, and what is the plan of the American decision makers these days?
Well, I think one of the things that they're trying to do is to rekindle relations with Europe, at least the way that they see it after the sort of tumultuous years of the Trump administration. I think they're trying to rebuild those relationships, particularly with Germany, with France, but also with the UK. It was often stated that there was some kind of special, relationship between Mrs. May and Mr. Trump, but we saw that wasn't necessarily the case, and he was quite, let's say, rude to her sometimes, and openly, publicly. So I think this was an attempt to come back to say that the United States is back, that the transatlantic relationship is still alive and kicking, and to sort of move back to business as usual. But I think there are going to be some important caveats there, because I don't think that business can ever be the same as it was before, prior to the Trump administration. And not just because of the Trump administration, but rather because of a number of other factors relating to geopolitical trends, particularly the rise of the People's Republic of China, and the more assertive stance taken by the Chinese Communist Party over the last 5 years, and particularly since the coronavirus outbreak. But also, I think it was an attempt to open channels to Moscow and to try and not reset the relationship, because that would be going too far, but rather to try to open channels in case there are some kinds of future developments that could be exploited, not only on the front of constraining the rise of China, but also subduing Russia's ambitions in Europe, particularly around the Black Sea region, but more generally as well.
Okay, but going more granular, and separating the particular fronts, what do you think has Biden achieved vis-a-vis Germany and Nord Stream and continental consolidation? Did he manage to convince Germany to ally with the US facing China or not? And how about France? And how does that play out? How do you see it?
I think that remains to be, I think that the answer to that is it remains to be seen. I don't think that he has had a great deal of luck in changing Germany's European orientation, because for Germany, at least, that orientation is more important than anything else. It might be the case that there have been, a common understanding is starting to develop across Europe in relation to the rise of China and the challenges that poses to the international order, particularly to US leadership in East Asia, and in the broader Indo-Pacific. I think it's very clear from the communiques of both the G7 summits and the NATO summit that took place earlier this month that there's an understanding now that China is actually a challenge. And even though the language in those communiques was quite sort of subdued, it was the first time that the leaders of the respective countries of those two groups, or the G7 and the NATO alliance, have actually, at least on paper, agreed to a common stance. Yes, there was mention of China in the communique of the 2019 NATO summit, but it was even weaker. But this seems to be the first time that they've come together to recognize at least the idea that China is a challenge. In that sense, there has been some success. I'd also say, to some extent, particularly in the G7 summit facilitated by the UK, but also that the US has applied some significant pressure to try and develop a common understanding, or at least to get those European countries to understand its sort of fears and its understanding of the strategic situation in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore there has been some movement on that front. But I think more broadly, in relation to the European Union and European security, I would say that at this moment there hasn't been a great deal of success, and Germany is likely to continue to push ahead with its established strategy, and France also, for a number of different reasons. And we heard only last week that the leaders of those two countries, France and Germany, making overtures yet again, and calls for new dialogues with Moscow in relation to European security.
Exactly. That was my question that was supposed to follow the previous one. So, after Biden having a meeting with Putin, suddenly Macron and Merkel wanted to have their own meetings with Putin as well, playing a separate pole of power, so to speak, in global affairs. So, do you think it's a testimony to the failure of Biden to sort of rekindle the West, the cohesion of West under the leadership of the US? And do you think that the continental leaders of France and Germany are already playing their own game, and they want maybe to make a decision to ally with the US, but after thorough considerations of pros and cons, not now, still sitting on the fence, or it's just some sort of a sideshow? What is your assessment of this situation?
Well, I think in many ways, continental European leaders, and I mean particularly here the leaders of France and Germany, they do actually want to have, their cake and eat it, to hark back to the sort of Brexit discussions of cakeism. On the one hand, they have the security guarantees from the United States, and to no small extent also from the UK, manifest through NATO to provide security and defence. And they sit behind a perimeter of countries that have done a lot over the last sort of 5 to 6 years, since the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine, to increase their defense spending. The Baltic states, Poland, Romania, all of those countries have increased their defense spending significantly in relation to the agreements that were reached at that time. But France and Germany have not yet managed to do that, as neither have some southern European countries. So on the one hand, they sit behind NATO security guarantees, manifest through the American and British commitment, but also the increases of the frontier states. And on the other hand, they're then free to maneuver to try and play this sort of third power role in the international order. And we saw that occurring last week. And we also saw it in relation to, as I was speaking about earlier, the issue of China. Because shortly after the communiques were released from the G7 and the NATO summits, Mr. Macron came out and said, and provided words that were somewhat different from those communiques, saying, China is actually not necessarily a threat, and we need to have a European perspective on this issue. And all those sorts of comments. So there is a degree of ambiguity here, and Europeans, particularly France and Germany, have to consider where their best interests lie. While that security guarantee is provided, it gives them a degree of freedom to maneuver, and that might not be in the advantage of the alliance or the Western grouping more broadly. I mean, that grouping, of course, is becoming wider than just the traditional West. It's now accommodating a number of different free and open countries, not only in the Indo-Pacific region, the Euro-Atlantic regions and beyond, but nonetheless, there is this kind of discrepancy. And I think that that's not going to go away in the years to come. In fact, it could even deteriorate and become a more open sort of wound within the Western order. And the United States will have a great deal of work on its hands to try and pull those allies together, because they do have increasingly different interests. And the rise of China is such that the economic gravity that it represents is also pulling a number of different countries in different directions, even countries as far away as Europe.
So, just in a nutshell, why are Germans and French behaving like that?
Well, they have different, I think they have different, and they have understood that they have now different geopolitical interests. So, I mean, in relation to Germany, there are a number of different energy interests in relation to Russia, and the import or the need for gas, particularly since Germany denuclearized in the last decade, or began the process of denuclearization. And more broadly, in relation to France, there is a desire, I think, to not only balance against Germany within the context of the European Union. After all, over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been an enormous transformation in those two countries' fortunes. If you go back into the 1980s and the 1990s, there was this perception that France was providing political leadership within the context of European integration. But over the last 10 years, at least, the rise of German power, both in an economic and a political context, means that France has sort of declined somewhat. So I think there is a desire on France's part, and this has been manifest quite substantially by President Macron, to play a more active international role. And insofar as this international role can be manifest, it gives France a degree of strategic purpose and leverage potentially over Germany within the European Union to assert and increase French, to support French interests. And that can be manifest through a number of different avenues, whether it's the activeness of France on the international scene, or also speaking on behalf of Europe. And this also goes down to a number of different initiatives that have been undertaken by France to try and increase European strategic autonomy, to boost the defense industrial application of the European industrial base, and also even things like the European Intervention Initiative. These are all attempts by France to capitalize on the areas where it has unique strength, and to try to leverage the European Union in a way that suits French interests. And all the while, Germany, of course, is doing its own thing. It's pursuing its own interests, both in terms of European integration, but also in relation to Russia. The management, at least on German terms, of the Eastern European region and the broader European neighborhood, where Germany at least wants to have a relative degree of stability, not only because of its military and strategic weakness, but also because of its economic interests, as it becomes increasingly integrated and tied in with the economies of Eastern Europe, stretching all the way down to the Black Sea from the Baltic. And in that context, you have to understand that there is a difference in interest between the two countries, both France and Germany, but also increasingly a difference of interest, I think, with the US and the UK. And that's why we've seen these sorts of political and economic difficulties over the last 10 years, as these changes have been felt, and they've sort of reverberated through the political leaderships of the respective countries.
Mm. You know, after Biden's visit to Europe, I was reading the French press, and I found what I had expected, actually, because this is a sort of consistent line since already for some time. Don't you think that France already decided that the US is going to lose its leadership role in the world, and France is simply trying to adjust its strategic position, and is disappointed that the Germans don't follow, and is disappointed that the remaining countries of Europe do not grasp where we are strategically? I also had some conversations with the French strategists, and this is how they view the world. So all those NATO, all those collective West thing is already a past memory. You could see it in the rear mirror, and let's not dwell upon it too much, so to speak. On the other hand, if you take a look at the geopolitical interests and economic interests of Germany, they could have the market from Atlantic coast of Europe to Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, okay, for their cars and manufacturing and tooling machines and stuff. And China is rising, and the US is in relative decline. So the economic interests of Germany, and also there's Russia and there is Turkey. Remember, the railway Berlin-Baghdad and so on, always a continental expansion of markets, the Mitteleuropa concept and so on. So there are also voices, at least here in Central and Eastern Europe, that the only constraint that Germans have is the memory of two lost wars to the English-speaking nations that didn't like it. So this is the only constraint and fear that Germans have, and that's why they stick to the Westbindung by Adenauer's Westbindung, because they fear that the moment they move independently, there is a penalty, there is a punishment by the Americans and British. So they want to sit on the fence, but the underpinning forces are driving them to the continental expansion. And the expansion of the EU is a very good example of that. Look how the balance of forces changed within EU. France in decline, Germany in the rise because of the Central and Eastern European markets, labor force, cheap labor, buffers, insecurity, buffer zones, in economic terms, cheap labor and supply chains and markets. That was a great period for Germany. So they can imagine they can, have it even more in the East. Is it the perception that you can hear or see in London when considering those strategic shockwaves that the rise of China and this, and all this inflection point that we are having now is having? Do you hear such voices in UK?
In London, do you mean?
Yeah, I mean,
well, there have certainly been murmurings to that degree. I mean, if you go back to one of the Ministry of Defence's global strategic trends documents that are produced every few years that outline the key strategic trends over the next 10 to 15 years, there was one that was produced, I think it was back in 2015, which stated quite explicitly that there is the risk, and I think it was very clear which country it was referring to, that a particular European country could rise so dramatically during that sort of next 10-year, 15-year cycle, that it would then become a kind of a challenge to the cohesion of the West. So it would have its economic interests manifest through the European Union, but then it would have a degree of strategic interest through NATO. But insofar as it becomes dominant in a European Union context, it might begin then to pull the entire European continental order towards its own interests, which in turn would infringe or damage the interests of NATO and the broader Euro-Atlantic sort of strategic or community security system. And these sorts of ideas have filtered through. They're normally more common on the political right of the Conservative Party, but nonetheless they are there. And I mean, you could say to some extent that the entire movement surrounding Brexit was animated by those ideas to an extent. I mean, there were a whole number of other factors at play as well, let alone the things that motivated the average voter on the streets in London or the UK more broadly during the 2016 referendum on EU membership. So there has always been this kind of background fear that the Euro-Atlantic order could be pulled apart, and that's what animated firstly British membership of Britain's desire to join the process of European integration, to get some kind of control over it, and to prevent France and Germany from taking it off in the directions that they consider to be more sort of preferential to their own interest, but also to ensure that there's a degree of binding between the Euro-Atlantic structures, i.e. the NATO alliance, and the more limited, but in some ways more expansive European integration project. And insofar as the UK has left the European Union, it's now lost a degree of control over its direction. So this adds to the complications that we've just discussed in relation to Euro-Atlantic security, which themselves have been further complicated by the rise of China and the focus of the United States. And you might add to that also in the respective ways the focuses of Britain, but also France in relation to the Indo-Pacific, because both countries have talked about an Indo-Pacific focus or tilt in Britain's case. And I think at least in France's case, this is about providing that sort of wriggle room in relation to Germany and the European Union to say that, France is still a global power. It has global interests with its overseas territories in the Indo-Pacific region, its military clout. And in Britain's case, it's about saying, well, actually, Britain is leaving the European Union, or it's left the European Union, but we still have a whole array of partnerships that we can build on in other parts of the world, particularly in the rising Indo-Pacific region. So we can, realize this vision of a global Britain that has a number of different interests around the world. We're not limited only to our European neighborhood or our own geographic proximity. So all of these different interests are coming out now, and they will put pressure on the existing order, manifest through the European Union as they already have, but also I think in time the NATO alliance, even though European countries, including the UK, are heavily dependent on that alliance for their security, and there's this kind of disconnect between reality and sort of desires and preferences. And they're pulling simultaneously in different directions.
Yeah, that is true. And before I will ask you the question about the situation of Central and Eastern Europeans, given all this, what is happening, and in that context, so what is your rough assessment of the Biden-Putin summit? Why Americans were doing it, and what was agreed upon?
I'm not entirely sure a great deal was agreed on. I think the primary role of that summit was to do two things. Firstly, to communicate to Moscow that there would be heavy penalties inflicted if the Kremlin meddles further in US domestic politics, and particularly trying to interfere in democratic procedures in the US, as well as issues pertaining or relating to cyber security. So I think the Americans made it very clear that there would be penalties inflicted on Moscow if the Kremlin did that or continues to do that in the future. But I think more generally, the objective, I think, as I said earlier, was simply to reopen a communication channel. There are discussions taking place in the US, and they're often quite quiet. But insofar as China has been identified as the key threat to US interests, both economically and geopolitically, I think there are some discussions, and there have been discussions on the sidelines, or at least thinking along such lines that actually Russia might be necessary in the future potential confrontation with China. I don't necessarily mean a military confrontation, but a sort of a rumbling era of strategic competition, not unlike the Cold War in the past. Where where Russia would be a piece on the sort of the go board or the chessboard, and in that sense, it can't be ignored. But then that leads us to all sorts of interesting, ideas about, well, what does that actually mean? Does that mean the United States gives or overlooks Russia's transgressions in the Black Sea region, or more broadly across the whole Eastern European theatre, in exchange for Russian support in relation to constraining or even containing China? Where does this lead us? Nobody at the moment knows, because it's a dynamic strategic environment. And of course, the US also has its interest in upholding Euro-Atlantic security. It can't allow the European theatre to become increasingly threatened by Russia, because also China is becoming increasingly active in the European theatre as well. So, I mean, some of the thinking that went ahead, 10 years ago about the US pivot or balance towards the Indo-Pacific is itself becoming increasingly outdated, because the Euro-Atlantic region can't be disconnected from the Indo-Pacific. The two regions, I think, as we discussed before, are in a way folding into one another, doing one much broader strategic region where all the major powers are competing again for influence, whether that's the US, Russia, and China, but also the UK, Japan, and so on and so forth. So what was achieved? I don't think a great deal beyond asserting or reasserting a number of different red lines, and also opening communication channels. But I don't think necessarily means that there's going to be a fundamental breakthrough in relation to US-Russia relations. I think that will come further down the line, if it comes at all, and it will be connected to a whole broader array of other issues relating particularly to China's rise.
Mm-hmm. let me ask you the question that I will format in the following way, James. I talked to you from Poland directly. I'm 40 kilometers from the Russian border now, as I speak. Of course, the geopolitical environment is deteriorating quickly in Poland and around. First of all, we have the sort of a lack of vision of the European Union, the conflictive interests of dealing with Russia and China between, as you know, the main powers in Europe, Germany and France, and Central and Eastern Europeans. And we have also the new US posture. First of all, pivoting or at least focusing on the Pacific, even if Europe and Pacific are, both ends of the same stick, being Eurasia in the US interest in Eurasia, still you need to sort of make priorities somewhere. And, meeting Biden meeting Putin at the same time with vital interests of Central Eastern European countries also located in countries that are not part of EU or NATO, being Belarus and Ukraine, and the developments there. So, given all that is happening, imagine that you're a decision maker in Warsaw. What would you do? How would you behave, James?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because I'm not a decision maker.
We always ask difficult questions because this is, and strategies, as Colin Gray used to claim, is all about asking questions.
Yes. Well, I think there would be probably three important kind of vectors or three important groups or baskets of things that I would do. Firstly, to consolidate Poland's position in relation to its nearest neighbors, so the Baltic states and Central Europe, but reaching all the way down to the Black Sea region. This sort of region that in the past or still today is called the Intermarium region, or today maybe even more the three C's idea. So consolidate a position there, focus energy on in getting those countries to increase their defense spending, at least to bring it up to that 2% level, even though that probably will be insufficient in the longer run. After all, it's a peacetime defense budget that was agreed in principle back in 2006 at the Riga summit, and then agreed again, of course, after the Russian annexation of Crimea. So that would be the first thing. And also to get greater coordination of military and strategic efforts between the countries in that region, potentially through a degree of Polish leadership, insofar as Poland is the biggest power in the region and a country that seems to be committed to increasing its defense spending, or at least increasing it. It's not constrained to the extent that Germany is in thinking about military matters, and it's not focused on Southern Europe or even the North African region and the Mediterranean to the extent that France is, which creates a kind of discrepancy between French interests in relation to Eastern Europe and French interests in relation to Southern Europe. So firstly, to consolidate the position in Poland's own neighborhood. Secondly, I suppose, would be to maintain a permanent and deepening link with both Washington, but also with London. We know that the United States is still a formidable military and economic power, and we've mentioned a few times, the idea of American decline. But actually, if you look at the strategic trends, it seems that it's not going to be the US that declines in terms of economic reach to the same extent that actually Europe is going to decline. If anyone is letting the West down at the moment, it seems to be Europe, and particularly continental Europe. So although Germany has been so ascendant over the last 10 to 15 years, both economically and politically, there are a number of trends relating to demography and broader economic issues which might have some impact there. So the US is going to remain a formidably powerful country, and it's going to keep, I think, a strong Euro-Atlantic focus, even if it has to navigate the rise of China and a more assertive Chinese Communist Party. So don't overlook the Americans. And then in relation to that sort of connection, also don't overlook London. Yes, the UK has left the European Union, but it hasn't left Europe. It can't leave Europe. It's a European country. And we've seen only recently, last week, that the UK continues to do a disproportionate amount to underpin the defence and security of Europe, whether that's through the enhanced forward presence measures in the Baltic region, but also increasingly in the Black Sea, where we saw HMS Defender challenge, Russian maritime claims in the Black Sea, upholding Ukrainian sovereignty. And it doesn't seem that there are really any other European countries that are prepared to do that to the same extent that London is. And the relationship between Britain and Russia is very bad, and I don't think it's going to improve anytime soon. The reason it's so bad is because Russia understands that the UK is actually quite a formidable power still, and that's why it's pushed much of its ire onto London in order to try and weaken it. So maintain a close relationship with the US and the UK, and you might even say, insofar as the US is going to have a greater focus on the Indo-Pacific in the years ahead, to focus even more on the UK, because the UK still has a number of different capabilities, a strategic mindset, and importantly, nuclear weapons to underpin the security of Europe through a kind of extended deterrence. And it's shown a willingness and inclination to do that by forwardly deploying its conventional assets to intersect with its nuclear capabilities and to maximize the overall deterring impact. So that would be the second thing that I would suggest. And then the third thing, I think, would be to focus on, Germany, because German economic power is not going to go away. Yes, it might be diluted in the years to come because countries like China will start manufacturing things that Germany currently is manufacturing, so it will go higher and higher up the value chain. But that doesn't mean that Germany won't go higher up the value chain as well. So the German economic leverage in the European Union, which Poland is of course a member, is not going to go away. So there also has to be a great deal of focus on Germany and trying to bring Germany closer to to Poland's political and geopolitical perspectives, and importantly economic and relating to that energy perspectives, to try and explain to Germany how important these are. I mean, don't forget as well that Germany, it is an eastern-facing country. So although it might have its interests in Russia, at the same time, it's also unlike France, or at least to a greater extent than France. It has geopolitical interests that are not so dissimilar from Poland's or from the UK's and the US's in relation to upholding that sort of line of frontier states within NATO and the EU, and preventing them from coming under Russian influence or interference. So in that sense, there might be something for Poland to do there, and also to try and build a bridge or to maintain an important connection between Germany and the UK going forward, because sometimes the relationship between London and Berlin has been somewhat rocky, and there clearly is I think a perspective in Germany, which might even be the dominant one, that Britain is in some ways, it's gone mad, or it's it's having some kind of personality disorder. And there needs to be some kind of thinking to draw those two countries together, because they were quite important in the context of upholding the defense of the West during the Cold War period. So there might be a role there as well that Poland could play in helping to facilitate greater dialogue between the two countries. So I think those would be the three things that I would recommend: strengthening Poland's position in its own neighborhood, strengthening relations or maintaining relations, and possible strengthening them in a new context with London and Washington, and maintaining a close relationship with Berlin, and if possible, trying to draw Berlin closer down a line which is preferential to Polish interests.
And James, building on that, what would happen if, having faced this sort of disappointment as expressed by Merkel and Macron, that the EU didn't decide to meet, at the proper level, Putin's Russia these days, because it was blocked by the Central and Eastern Europeans. What would happen if the European Union decided to enforce the consolidation of foreign policy and subjecting the national foreign policies to the new continental state emerging entity? Because in the great power competition in Eurasia, we want to be a separate pole of power, so you need to consolidate this, of course. And who is going to be in charge? Either French or German, to be later decided who particular, because they will also quarrel internally between themselves. But first, let's clear up the situation with those smaller guys on the periphery. So what will happen then, James? How do you think?
Well, I mean, this is a complicated issue. I mean, it could be the case that a blocking coalition, I mean, if some kind of qualified majority voting were applied to EU foreign and security and defense policy, it could just be that on certain issues that were important to Poland, like this one, that some kind of blocking coalition could be brought together, because there are now a number of countries that do not accept that, French, German perspective in relation to Russia. I mean, overtures.
James, if I may, because we talk about power politics. That as you know, is the real essence of foreign policy, and the decorum, the decorations are the other thing. So, voting majorities, it doesn't matter too much if you have this mechanism of loans and financial aids and grants, okay, that might be collateralized or sort of conditional, or you know how it works. We can help Greece, providing that Greece is nice, okay? We can provide help under this COVID emergency policy, financial help, on condition that but the condition will be decided later in Brussels or in Berlin. So, by the way, it has always worked like that. The empire building exercise was always like that, slowly but steadily.
Well, I can only speak from my own country's perspective. There, we were never particularly, we never particularly liked the idea of qualified majority voting being applied to foreign and defence policy, because it means that the nation's fundamental interests then become compromised by the broader grouping. And if there are, those really important fundamental issues, then it becomes increasingly difficult to maximize national leverage. So, if I were Poland, I would try probably to prevent that from happening, come what may. I'm not sure that's the way forward for the European Union, and I don't think that's the way forward for upholding a firmer, more robust line against Russia. I think there will always be this desire, to an extent, on France and Germany's part, to have dialogues with Russia. But I don't think that dialogues are what are needed here. What we need actually is something that's more robust, that constrains and even attempts to contain Russia. So we need a sort of a more British approach, not a more Franco-German one on this matter.
Yeah, but still, you have this privilege of being behind the channel. So you have more maneuvering room, or at least it seems, and it has worked over centuries like that. And this is why you made those decisions and you became the maritime empire. It's much more difficult to do it in the landlocked environment, in the very congested and populated Europe, France, between Germany and Russia. But let me give you a few thoughts how difficult and what sort of difficult situation Central and Eastern European has found itself, and this is going to be a big thing this time around. First of all, it is true that the most important fundamental security interest is to keep Russia out of the European balancing system, and it was successfully delivered over the majority of the last 500 years by the Polish state in the Commonwealth, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Of course, in the industrial era, it was not like that. That's why the perceptions of the Western Europeans got addicted to this fact that it was not successful. This is why Lavrov has been speaking recently, and Macron as well, that without Russia you can't make a sort of a security architecture. It's not true. You can. That's a fundamental difference of perspectives. You may very well. Was there any security architecture after the demise of the Soviet Union? There was, and successful and peaceful, right? Because Russians were out of the balancing game.
Exactly.
Was the security architecture possible after the Versailles Treaty in the East? Yes, it was. And there were many countries here. It was demolished because of the German question, not because of the Soviets.
Mm-hmm.
And Soviets were out of the game because of the Versailles and because they lost the war to Germans and then to Poles in 1920. So they were out of the balancing game. And we had independence, and the Lithuanians had independence, and Latvians had independence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this is the fundamental difference of interest that Poles will never give in.
Mm-hmm.
And if the collective system of NATO and European Union doesn't operate this interest of ours, things will change. Poland has exercised strategic restraint over the last 30 years, James, because our security interests are in the intermarium, not in Europe, in the belt of countries between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. And there is enough potential to contain Russia if we ally. And Ukraine is a pivot. Poland has gone to wars over Ukraine 19 times with Russia. And, you know, given the new generation warfare, we have believed over the last 10 years that NATO will deal with that. We have also believed that EU, the West, whatever you call it, will deal with that, given the enormous advantage that the West enjoys over Russia. So we exercise strategic restraint. I think that we are coming to the inflection point. So this is the message that I would like to say, that things are changing in Warsaw, just as they changed in Turkey, 10 years ago. Just like they changed in many other places in the world. And that will create, of course, tensions with Germany, because Germans are heavily dependent on the supply chains of Mittel Europa. So there will be a lot of turbulence if, you know, those current trajectories compound, so to speak. So this is what I wanted to say. We are very much perplexed and concerned what is going on here.
And you have every right to be.
Also, we understand why the Americans are doing it, but we don't like they do it over our heads, and that we don't know what they talk about.
Yes.
That may simply unleash hell, because if you exercise strategic restraint, so you don't play the balancing game. But once you start playing the balancing game, then you take a look at the map, and there is no security architecture in Europe, in this part of Europe, without Poland. And this is the fundamental difference that is growing up here in Warsaw. And the emotions are rising. So there are many mental maps that sort of are in play. Like, for example, that France completely don't see countries east of the Elbe River and the Oder River. They want to invite Russia to play the balancing game against Turkey, even against US, and maybe against Germany if times come.
No, I think there, though, we have a common interest both in London and in Warsaw in keeping the Russians out. I would say keeping intra-European rivalry down, and keeping the Americans, the Canadians, and I suppose the British also in. So in a way, the fundamental interest hasn't changed since Lord Ismay outlined his vision for NATO all those years ago. It's just about realizing it in a new geostrategic context.
I think it's good time to end the conversation, and of course with the promise and hope that we will continue our series. So if I may already say, we have a series of episodes and conversations. James, our guest at Strategy and Future was James Rogers, Council on Geostrategy, a think tank based in London, UK. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
That was a pleasure. My name is Jacek Bartosiak, and you always stay with us at Strategy and Future. Take care.